Good morning. My name is Jill Elwood. I am the Nonprofit Programming and Relations Manager at One Valley Community Foundation, your hosts of Nonprofit Cafe. Our mission is to connect people who care to causes that matter so that all can thrive in Gallatin County. And one of the ways we do that is through nonprofit capacity building. So thank you so much for being here. For our first Nonprofit Cafe of the year, welcome back. I hope you guys all had a great summer break. We have missed you. I have a couple of announcements and then I will turn it over to Melanie because I know that is why we are all here. First and foremost, we are here for some professional development, but also to get to know other folks in the nonprofit sector. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to at least introduce yourselves in the chat, we would so deeply appreciate it. Our icebreaker question today is to introduce yourself and your nonprofit and your biggest fear when it comes to nonprofit compliance. So what is it when it comes to nonprofit compliance that makes you nervous? And the reason may be that you're here today. So name, organization, and compliance fears. No wrong answers, no judgment. We are all here to learn together. So please take a moment, find your chat, and introduce yourselves. Um, Again, name, organization, and your biggest fear when it comes to nonprofit compliance. While you all are doing that, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. First Security Bank has come back for, I think, the eighth year in a row as our headline sponsor for Nonprofit Cafe. We are so grateful for them. And as always, in our in-person sessions, we are also supported by Rockford Coffee and the Bozeman Public Safety Center. As you are joining this morning, it looks like everyone is already muted with their cameras off. If you could keep yourselves on mute, if it's not a question and answer time or a breakout room or anything like that, we appreciate it. If you want to turn your cameras on, it is a lot more fun to chat to faces and not black boxes, but it is up to you and your internet connection. But thank you again for being here. I also just want to take a moment to share a little bit about our programming for the year because we are going to have some changes this year that make our programming a little different than usual. You may have noticed that we are only offering 5 nonprofit cafe sessions this year instead of 10. So these are a hot commodity. We're very grateful that you're here and grateful that Melanie is facilitating and hosting today. I am getting ready to have twins. So I will be out for a large portion of the year. I'm taking an extended maternity leave. And so our programs are going to be a little bit abbreviated this year, but we are very excited for the 5 sessions that we did pick. I picked really carefully to try to give you guys 5 awesome sessions. So I hope you'll make it to as many as you can. I also just want to note that we are hiring an interim staff member to cover my position for the next 5 months while I'm out on leave. So if you know anyone who wants to run Give Big this year and Nonprofit Cafe and be part of the One Valley team, we posted the position yesterday and would love to have our nonprofit friends apply for it. All of that being said, the real reason we're here, thank you, Naomi. I appreciate the love. I also appreciate that you're sending it with your little guy in your lap. The reason we are here is to chat nonprofit compliance. And I am so excited for this topic because I think it's something that comes with a lot of fear and a lot of consequences and repercussions for not doing so correctly. But I think it's also something that when we've been in the nonprofit world for a long time, it's a little bit intimidating to ask questions about because there's a sense of like, we should already be doing this. But no judgment today. This is a safe learning space. We are so grateful to have Melanie Schell here with us today. She is a seasoned nonprofit attorney with extensive experience as an executive level manager, in-house counsel, communication strategist, and plan gift specialist. She's the managing principal and general counsel for Bannack Group, and she counsels nonprofit organizations in our area and many other areas as well. She is one of the foremost experts in nonprofit law, compliance, fundraising, operations policies, board management. There's almost no topic that I could throw at Melanie that she wouldn't be able to speak on. But we are very grateful to have her here today to share some tips and tricks and checklists for nonprofit compliance. so we can make sure that you all are staying legal, staying compliant, and staying out of trouble. So all of that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie. Big virtual round of applause for her. Thank you for being here, Melanie. And if anyone has any questions or if there's anything I can do to make this session more accessible for you, feel free to chat me in the chat box or send me an email. Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you sharing your Friday morning with me, especially jumping on with the topic of compliance. I only kind of half jokingly started the description of this session with that word boo, because so often that is kind of the, quite frankly, attitude that is around nonprofit compliance. Not because anybody thinks we shouldn't have to do it, but more because nobody really wants to do it. Primarily because we kind of live in this somewhere on the continuum of fear and anxiety as it relates to nonprofit compliance. And so my hope today is to provide you with some comfort to know that, what the sphere of compliance is that applies to your organization is quite honestly, probably the same sphere that applies to most every other nonprofit. There are definitely some nuances within the world of compliance that apply to specific nonprofits doing specific things. But when it comes to kind of that core level of compliance, there's a universality associated with that. So we're going to walk through 4 different levels of compliance. It's really 3 levels, then the 4th one of like how to get it done through the session today. My hope is to wrap up at about 10:15 to allow for questions. But also if there are questions along the way, feel free to drop those in the chat. Can't guarantee I'll see them because I get to talking and then I just keep talking. But I certainly would see them at the during the discussion portion. I've also been taking kind of a tally as to the responses as it relates to those fears. And what I'm seeing the vast majority of folks saying is their fear of the unknown, their fear of missing something. So hopefully we'll be able to actually completely alleviate that fear by virtue of one of the materials that is included in this presentation, which, by the way, you can have access to. I'll send it to Jill so that she can forward it out. And that should alleviate that concern as far as missing something. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It was giving me fits a moment ago, so hopefully it will work. Just one moment. Look at that. Fantastic. Now I need to get rid of this. Just a moment. Okay. All right, so the idea behind this presentation is to try to make nonprofit compliance as quick and easy as possible. We all have big things that we want to accomplish as it relates to our mission, and rarely does, filling out a form or ensuring that you actually submitted that form, rarely is that the top priority on your mind. And too often it's the thing that gets in the way of us being able to do the work that we want to do. So I said before that the agenda is walking through 4 levels of nonprofit compliance. I always like to start, if you've been in my presentations before, including the couple of people who are on here today that were in a presentation last night, the first few slides are kind of where I always like to start to give people this idea of what the landscape of nonprofits looks like in the nation and in Montana. I admittedly need to update these numbers. These are 2022 numbers, but nevertheless, I mean, they're not lower, let's put it that way, than where we are, or they're lower now than where we are right now. So within the national sector, we've got about 1.6 million C3 organizations. Not every single one of those is a public charity. A lot of them are private foundations, and certainly not all of them are small, large, anywhere in between. They're all forms of different C3 organizations. We are seeing a steady increase in the number of C3 organizations, a really big increase over that first 20-year period from 2001, which is no surprise, just coming out of some of the chaos of the economy at that time, as well as some world and national events that occurred that would have created that need for an increase. That increase has slowed down a little bit, but it's still on the rise. We are, as a nonprofit space, very much an economic driver, creating about 6% of the US's GDP to the tune of just under $840 billion a year. That's just in the revenue side of things. And value side of things. And what's really fascinating to me is that 1 in 4 Americans actually indicate that they do volunteer in the nonprofit space. You can define volunteer all sorts of different ways, and I think it was pretty loose as far as what the definition was when they were asking for this. But nevertheless, what it means is that at least 25% of Americans have a predilection to actually help work in the nonprofit space, which is fantastic. In Montana, we've heard these stats before. We have the highest per capita number of C3 organizations of any state in the nation. There's about 6,800 or so across this state. With no surprise, some significant density here in Bozeman. We'll also see it in Missoula, Billings as well. And that's primarily population driven and, quite frankly, revenue driven. That is where pockets of money are. So it makes sense that is where pockets of nonprofits tend to exist. It is really important to understand, though, there is a very big difference between the nonprofits in Montana. We have a lot of nonprofits that are very, very small. Like, not sure how they're operating small. Probably very project specific as opposed to mission driven. That's not a negative. It may very well be a commentary on why they were created. And so there's only about 20% of nonprofits that have budgets over that $100,000 mark. By just a quick look at the organizations that are on here, I think you all fall into that 20%. But even with 20%, we're still in a pretty crowded landscape. We're all fighting for dollars. And when we're fighting for dollars, this is kind of what charitable giving looks like. In 2022, there were almost $500 billion given to nonprofit organizations, and 64% of them were coming from individuals. You can see here, 21% from foundations, 9% from planned gifts or bequests, and then 6% from corporations. And we can discuss and come up with interpretations of this or implications of this pie graph in a lot of different ways to apply to a lot of different situations. But the bottom line is what it is that the vast majority of money, meaning 85% of money, is coming from folks that really, quite frankly, are going to really care about whether or not you are a compliant organization, if you're operating at a level that you're supposed to be. So we talk about then, how do we separate ourselves, right? If we've got 6,800 organizations in Montana, 1.6 million organizations in the United States. I almost said 1.6 billion. That would have been something. We really need to figure out a way to make ourselves stand out. And so there's 1,001 ways to do that, some of which are not good ways to make yourself stand out, and others that are very good and very recommended sort of ways. It includes having a solid board. It includes having a clear and visible impact, but it also includes making sure that you, quite frankly, don't get on a naughty list somewhere. It is astonishing to me how many people let me back up. Have you heard of the phrase sophisticated donor? I'm sure, in the grand scheme of things, that has come up. When we use that phrase, most people think like millionaires and billionaires are sophisticated donors. In our world, in Bannack's world, we think of sophisticated donors as anybody who actually wants to peek behind the curtain. And it is amazing to me how many individuals get and understand how to find information on nonprofits and do their research. That's more than just looking at GuideStar. It includes actually looking at the IRS website to find out whether or not an organization is still tax exempt. And we've seen issues here in the Valley recently of organizations getting on that revocation list quite frankly, in ways that they just never should have. So we're going to try to get you armed with the information that you need in order to make sure that you stay off of that revocation list and in the like side of the column of organizations of those sophisticated donors. So from my vantage point, like I said, getting compliant and staying compliant is one of the best ways that you can set yourself apart from organizations. When it comes to compliance, I always also kind of like to ask the question of why does it matter? Most people will say the IRS, keeping the IRS out of your business, right? That's the primary reason that compliance matters. But the reality is that IRS audits are very rare when it comes to nonprofit organizations. And that's true across the board, not just small organizations, but even really big organizations. IRS audits are very rare. However, state interest in nonprofits is a little bit more active. Not necessarily here in Montana. We have the Attorney General has other fish to fry. And so nonprofits still don't get necessarily the same level of attention that other state attorney generals give to their organization. But what matters is just because you're housed here in Montana doesn't mean that Montana is the only attorney general that might be interested in what you're doing. So it's important to understand that there are compliance obligations outside of the state if you have any operations outside of the state, and we'll talk about that in here just a little bit. So when we talk about why does compliance matter, of course, there's lots of 1,000 different reasons, but we really want to avoid legal issues. We really want to be able to attract and retain donors and employees and volunteers, board members, all of those. You also want to save money. Honestly, if you get out of compliance, it costs money to get back in compliance, and it costs a lot less just to stay compliant. So ensuring that you're saving money, of course, protecting that C3 status, and then also that one down in the middle here of the center bottom is that unfettered pursuit of the mission. When you are not laying awake at night wondering whether or not you actually are compliant for whatever reason, you're not thinking about the new and unique ways that you can actually pursue your mission. So we want to try to get some of that chatter out of the system and get you moving in the right direction. Of course, this is just a slide that says, if you have lawsuits, rumors, bad press, and IRS action, donors are going to be like, no thanks, don't want to really get involved with you. But if you can show your impact, you have happy donors, good press, or even no press equals good press, just FYI, when it comes to compliance, at least, not when it comes to impact, but when it comes to compliance, they're of course going to be more likely to give to you. So let's jump into the compliance components. So I said before, there's sort of these 4 levels. I'm going to go through 3 primary levels and then hit on the how do we stay compliant piece. So when we talk about the world of compliance, I like to describe it as being both straightforward and also quite nuanced, which definitely sounds like an oxymoronic sentence. But the reality is it's straightforward because there are checklists. In many instances, there are very clear, bright lines of what needs to be done and when it needs to be done by which organizations. The nuanced component is sometimes in that, but when? As in, I am a C3 organization. It is May 15th following my tax year, or I should say, the 15th day of the 5th month following the close of my tax year. I know I need to file a 990, right? But which 990 do I need to file? That's the nuanced component. Do I need to add some schedules to it? That's another nuanced component. And so when it comes to compliance, if you can nail the actual base level piece as it relates to the straightforward components, it leaves you a lot more brain power to be able to make those determinations on the nuanced side of things. Okay, so when we come to first level, we talk about this from the standpoint of basic internal order. Every single level is going to have this red flag component because it's intended to be kind of an issue spotting screen for you. So when it comes to basic internal order, the red flags that we see are We have board members who have been there since the dawn of time. We have meetings that are happening way too often or lasting way too long. We're seeing lots of conflicts of interest or conflicts of interest that we think need to be addressed and aren't getting addressed. Those are real common red flags for failure to adhere to basic internal order, at least at the board level. Sometimes we're also getting love letters from the state, from the Secretary of State, the Montana Department of Revenue, hopefully not one from the Attorney General, but those little love letters are also a good indicator that you've got some basic internal compliance issues. Holes in corporate records. You can't find minutes. Okay, that is scary in the long run. You don't know where your articles of incorporation are, or they're really outdated. I mean, I've seen articles of incorporation that I don't know how sheepskin scans, but apparently it can, because some of them are super outdated, and we want to get those types of things squared away. We'll also see what I call internal transparency complaints. When I say internal, I truly mean internal to your organization. There's like this feeling of like, I don't really know what's going on in this organization. I'm not really trusting what's going on inside of this organization from your board, from your staff, from your volunteers. So we see some of those concerns. And then just kind of overarching malaise or dissatisfaction among employees and volunteers. So those are kind of common red flags when it comes to basic internal order. When we're talking about basic internal order, we're kind of talking about some significant subsections of compliance. But we're really at the big level talking about basic corporate compliance. I feel like I need to walk around with a t-shirt that says, a nonprofit is just the flavor of your business, and underline the word business, because it is really important for everybody involved in your nonprofit organization, especially executives, especially key staff, but most especially your board, that they understand that the nonprofit is a corporation, a capital C corporation, like literally defined in the Montana state statutes. And you have to adhere to standard corporate compliance rules. The add-on component to that is you also happen to be a nonprofit version of a corporation as opposed to a for-profit corporation. So there's other C3 specific compliance things that we'll talk about here in a minute. But when we're talking about basic internal order, we're talking about standard corporate compliance. You need to be writing meeting minutes. Your meeting minutes do not need to be a dictation of your meetings. In fact, they should not be. They can be basic from the standpoint of action, vote, approval. Hopefully you're taking the number of votes as in like, unanimous or 10 for, 1 against, 1 abstained. That's great. You don't need to add a ton of color to your meeting minutes. Find sort of the happy medium to create for your organization where you're creating a history that you can go back to without creating a documentary, okay? The big thing about it is that when you have those meeting minutes, you're creating the corporate record that should be a reference for you and not a liability for you if something should happen. So we want to find that happy medium. In addition, we want to make sure that we've got those organizing documents in order, making sure that they are up to date and accurate, an accurate reflection of what you're actually doing. When I talk about organizing documents, I'm primarily talking about your articles of incorporation and your bylaws. As a side note, it's really important to make sure you all understand that your bylaws are not public documents, or at least they do not need to be public documents. Your articles of organization are public. So if somebody were to ask you for that, you can either direct them to the Secretary of State's website or provide them with the document. Your bylaws, you can actually say no, unless you have some other rationale for like specific codified reason to provide your bylaws. Also, there shouldn't really be anything scathing in your bylaws that wouldn't be a problem to, that would be a problem if you handed it to somebody. Anyway, record keeping is super important. Annual filing, it is astonishing to me how many organizations forget this. I mean, I feel like I need to, we'll say it's a cup of coffee, pour myself a cup of coffee on April 16th and start scrolling through all the nonprofits that I know about and see how many of them have triggered a non-compliant scenario because they didn't file the dang online document that can literally be like 3 clicks to submit and is free. The cost of that filing has been waived. It was last year and it is again this year. I'm a firm proponent of filing it on January 1st or as soon as thereafter. Don't wait, get it done. So that annual filing is just the corporate filing, basically saying to the Montana Secretary of State, we're still operating in the state of Montana, and we'd still like to be in the good graces of the Secretary of State. Insurance, making sure that you've got that general liability. Hopefully everybody's familiar with the D&O insurance, which is the directors and officers insurance, also sometimes known as errors and omissions. That's E&O policy. If you have employees, I strongly recommend that you get employment and employment practices insurance as well. And there's other situation-specific insurance rationale along the way. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple of things and just allow you to read through those. Your governing documents, the big thing as it relates to the articles and the bylaws, you need to be reviewing those every 2 to 3 years. And by you, I mean your board. They are the key governing documents for your organization. Everything should trickle down from those. And it is astonishing to me how many organizations are not in compliance with their bylaws on a daily. That's bananas to me. So it's important to have that calendared, and we'll talk about a calendar here in just a moment. I said before that the conflict of interest arena is one of the key areas that people have problems with from a compliance standpoint. It 100% is. If I were to take 2 things on this list that actually are the key areas where people mess up, it is truly this basic corporate compliance, primarily this annual filing, and this conflict of interest piece. Number 1, the number of organizations that either do not have a conflict of interest policy or Googled one up and called it good. Both of those are unacceptable situations for an organization. You need a policy that is signed every single year by every single board member and preferably key employees. I like to see key employees do it as well. And then there needs to be training and an understanding that the conflict of interest disclosure form is not a one and done disclosure form. It's not just every 365 days we disclose our conflicts of interest. There's an ongoing obligation as well. So it's important to do those. If you're going to look at the 2 key basic internal compliance violations, those 2 are definitely there. This is going to sound like a throwaway, but it's super important if you have employees. Make sure you have written job descriptions that are not task specific, but are role and responsibility specific. And then make sure that you have signed employment contracts or signed employment agreements. And then the last thing there is to make sure that you have your personnel files in order and stored separately from other hiring information. So personnel file is different than hiring information. Personnel file is generally more like performance reviews, et cetera, et cetera. You just want to make sure that if somebody comes and says, hey, we need that information, you can just pull that file as opposed to having to search through everything. My goodness, apparently my watch has been listening to me this whole time, and I just got this like huge, long dictated thing that I've been saying. That's a lot of words. Okay, so one of the biggest ways to deal with the basic internal order is to create a board governance calendar. This board governance calendar is actually one of the best that I've seen. It comes out of a Canadian organization. So there's certainly some nuances in here, or like, spelling of things that are a little different than we would do. But the idea of it is very good from the standpoint of you do not need this like multi-page pivot table, beautiful paid subscription board governance calendar. You can just have a Word document that has 12 boxes. That's all you need in order to create an actual annual governance calendar. The annual governance calendar should include those overarching board functions. When our board and committee meetings, you don't have to necessarily have the date, but like we're meeting in January, we're meeting in April, maybe on the quarter or whatever. When does strategic planning happen? When do self-evaluation happen? There's all sorts of other components in there for sure. And I'll leave that to you to read. But from a governance standpoint, it is critically important that you have those key governing components in here. When is it that we're going to review the 990 as a board? And we'll talk more about the 990 here in a little bit. The evaluation of an executive director, et cetera, et cetera. I am going to give you a checklist at the end of this that's going to help be kind of the augmentation to getting the actual calendar done. But nevertheless, my point here really of this slide is to show that there's a very simple format for a board governance calendar. You don't need to spend a ton of time to try to figure out to make it look pretty or complicated. It just doesn't need to be that way. The biggest thing is making sure that there's the establishment of who's responsible for what. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through this. Questions so far? I cannot see the comments. So Jill, I'm going to have to rely on you.
No questions so far, just some encouragement and folks saying they're loving this and it's very helpful. So
good, 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 good. Okay. Level 2 is 501c3 specific compliance. I said before that level 1 is really about the fact that you're a corporation. Level 2 is you're a nonprofit. Okay. You'll notice that there are some things that are not in here because there are some things that are specific to C3 organizations doing specific things. We're going to talk about advocacy. We're going to talk about charitable solicitation registration. So giddy up. But within the C3 specific compliance, where we see the most common red flags are this confusion about how are we doing things? How do we go about doing things? Internal consistencies on process as well as output. So from the standpoint of like, well, last week we received 10 gifts and all of those got receipted. And this week we received 5 gifts and we haven't receipted any. That's an example of an internal consistency of inconsistency of process and output. IRS love letters. These are rare, thankfully. And the worst thing about these, other than the like absolute heart attack inducing feeling that you get when you see that a revenue envelope come to you, is that the IRS human system and their computer system, they are not synced with one another. So there's a lot of individual or a lot of organizations as well as individual taxpayers who feel like they've gotten something taken care of, but they keep getting letters from the IRS because they talked to a human and got it actually squared away at the IRS level, but the computer hasn't caught up. Those are some of those love letters as well, which is why it's important to be able to have a checklist to say, I did that, I got that done, so I can ignore those types of, well, maybe not ignore, but not lose sleep over the fact that these love letters are coming in. The last one was internal transparency complaints, external transparency complaints as well. Like, you're a donor is asking you for your 990 and you can't give it to them. That's a problem. You are being asked, I mean, I worked at the MSU Foundation for years. We would get FOIA requests all the time, Freedom of Information requests. We always got to say no to those because we were a private organization. Although we did make decisions as to whether or not we would disclose information just because it's in the best interest. But that external transparency where people are asking you for information or they are looking for information and can't find it. I threw auctions, raffles at 50/50s, et cetera, in here. In reality, I could have thrown it in the next one, but I thought it was important to flag it because when we're talking about C3 organizations, we're generally talking about organizations trying to raise money, right? And there's all sorts of interesting ways that we do that. We see a lot of auctions. I've seen a lot of questions of like, but if somebody gives me a bunch of wine and I auction that, is that really like, am I the one who's giving away the wine? What if we sell tickets, and they can, oh my God, stop. Creativity generally is not rewarded when it comes to the IRS, just FYI. If you employ an executive director, there's a red flag there, not because it's an executive director, but it's definitely a new compliance realm that you need to be looking at. And then late 990s. I will talk about late 990s in here in a moment and my feeling for them, and I will try not to get super hot under the collar when I talk about those. But those are kind of your common red flags when we're looking at 501c3 specific compliance. So there are 2 slides related to kind of the groups of things that we need to be looking at when we're talking about C3 specific compliance. There are some sets of policies and procedures that are unique to C3 organizations that are absolutely necessary to have. If you are in the world of receiving gifts of any kind, you better dang well have a gift acceptance policy. The rationale for that is because even if you're only used to accepting cash right now, someday somebody's going to ask you if you'll take their llamas. True story. Somebody is going to ask you about a gift annuity. Somebody is going to ask you about something. And it's a lot better to have the gift acceptance policy already written and discussed versus trying to figure it out on the fly. There's 1,000 examples of these out there. Again, don't just Google up, copy, or find and replace the company name or the nonprofit name and call it good. Really think through it. What are you as an organization willing to accept as a type of gift? Is it just cash or cash equivalent? Are you going to take used cars? Are you going to take works of art, sculptures, animals? I just had a question, a really interesting question of whether somebody can use their stored hay. Yes, this is a real question. Whether somebody can use their stored hay to fund a charitable gift annuity. Well, my first question was, well, what does your gift acceptance policy say? The response was, well, we don't have a gift acceptance policy. Like, we have to have a broader conversation. By the way, the answer is yes, you can use stored hay to fund a gift annuity. It's not specifically the hay, it's the value of the hay, and you have to convert that, and there's all sorts of steps involved in there. But nevertheless, having that gift acceptance policy at the outset would at least have answered the initial question, will we take crops for in exchange for gifts? Okay, records retention policy is important to have. That's a guiding light from a compliance standpoint as when you absolutely should be getting rid of records. The biggest downfall of records retention is not following it. And suddenly you have 1,006 years of documents on hand. Don't do that. Digitized documents are totally fine in this day and age. A whistleblower policy is important, also considered to be a, what's the word? Why can't I think of the word of when you are going after somebody? Retaliation, non-retaliation policy. Those are synonymous with one another. You also need to have a finance and investment policy because you've got money. So how are you dealing with that? And then, of course, that conflicts of interest. On the situational side of things, I think it's really important in this day and age to at least have a section in a policy somewhere of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most organizations talk about basically their adherence to the protected status of individuals. But the DE&I statement goes beyond that. So it basically talks about more of the philosophy of the organization. So I think it's important that if you are a type of organization that wants to have a statement as it relates to inclusivity, that you actually do have that conversation, usually at the board level. Personnel handbook, critical from an employment standpoint. I like to see a policy or at least a policy statement on grant making. This again is more philosophical than anything else, unless you do have some nuanced components as to how, when you would make your grants. And then I'm just going to skip over a couple of these. If you have an endowment or have any sort of restricted funds, it's important to have those fund policies and the endowment policy on hand. I got a ping that there's a chat, so let me know, Jill, like give me a signal if I need to take a breath. There's a lot of other pieces in this particular section that you can go through. The one that I want to quite frankly harp on is the next one, the 990. It is ridiculous how many organizations find their proverbial butts in a sling because they've screwed up the 990. When I talked about before late 990s being a red flag, in my opinion, a 990 is late if it has not been filed on the 15th day of the 5th month after the organization's tax year. I get and understand that there's an automatic extension if you ask for it, but unless something really crazy has happened within the organization, in my opinion, there is no reason that it should have taken over 4 months to get your books closed and cleaned and put into those components on the 990. Some of those good reasons are we have limited people available in Bozeman in order to help you get the 990s done. I get that. That's a perfectly legitimate reason. But if we are dragging our feet or for whatever reason, our bookkeeper can't get the books closed or whatnot, it's rare that we have so much complexity or we see so much complexity in a nonprofit's books that warrants that long of time in order to get the books closed and actually put into the 990 form. The reason it really matters is, quite frankly, you've already put the IRS on notice that you can't get that document filed in a timely manner. That's not good. When the IRS is actually looking at 990s for inconsistencies and incompleteness, if you are giving them 3 extra months to think about you, that's a problem. We just don't want to do that. In addition, there's quite frankly what I call trickle down chaos. And that means basically if you're so many other filing or deadlines are tied to the deadline, the standard deadline for a 990. If you're an organization that needs to register to solicit in other states, which we're going to talk about, you have automatically created another extension requirement for you because you can't file in that state or renew in that state because you don't have your 990 filed. Get your 990s filed in a timely manner, 15th day of the 5th month following your tax year. Again, I get that there's exceptions, but make sure that do everything you can to get them done in that time. Also, number 1, make sure your board has reviewed that 990 prior to actually filing it. There is, if you don't know, on the full 990 and on the EZ, there's an actual checkbox that basically goes through governance components and asks the question whether or not the board had the opportunity to review the 990 prior to filing. I have done many board assessments, and it is crazy to me how about probably 1 in 3 of those assessments comes back and says the board is not reviewing that 990 ahead of time. Yet lo and behold, the 990 says they did. Well, now you have committed fraud. So that's not a compliance issue. That's you literally lied to the IRS. Can we not do that, please? Can we just not do that? Schedule a meeting, send it out, whatever you need to do in order to get that review taken care of, get that done. And then the other component where we see the most amount of problems within the 990 is just quite frankly incompleteness. We fail to attach or include the necessary schedules. We fail to follow the 990 is such a, like, if you answered yes here, answer down here. If you said no, skip, there's definitely the follow the bouncing ball component that needs to happen. It's kind of the choose your own adventure book that we used to have. Those were great books, by the way. Those were great books. Anyway, make sure that they are complete, and also consider the fact, as an aside, consider your 990 a marketing tool. In both the 990 and the 990 EZ, you have the opportunity to describe what the organization is doing from an impact standpoint. It is a marketing tool. It's a public document. I can find your 990 in less than 10 seconds. It might not be your current 990, but it's probably going to be last year or the year before. If I'm a sophisticated donor, I'm going to be looking for those things. And I want to know that this organization is, quite frankly, tooting its own horn, but more importantly, is actually doing what it says it does. A couple of things. The other component about the 990 where I see the where we see the other issue is if you are not required to file the big 990s, the 990 or the 990 EZ, specifically then, so we're talking pretty much about the postcard, there's a whatever type of scenario. And because it's so easy to do, as in like it's 3 clicks, we forget to do it. The postcard 990 is one of the most common 990s to fail to file to get you on the auto revocation list because it's the easiest to forget. Also, it tends to be, applicable to really small or a lot smaller organizations that maybe haven't necessarily thought too much about compliance. If you get on the automatic revocation, don't think it's the end of the world. There are ways to get back off of that. We could do a whole nother session on how to deal with that. Okay, I'm seeing the chat getting higher. So let me take a second and run through anything that I need to pay attention to.
We do have one question. Most of it was just chats about me sending out the slides. But we did have one question whether the full board needs to review the 990 or if the executive committee reviewing it is acceptable.
So the legal answer would be the executive committee would be acceptable if the executive committee is provided with the authority to act on behalf of the board. That's the legal response. The ethical response is the whole board should be looking at that. The whole board has not ceded their fiduciary duty to the executive committee, and their fiduciary duty to be informed, i.e. act with duty in adhere to the duty of care, as well as the duty of obedience, as in making sure that the organization is doing what it says it's doing according to the laws and policies that apply. That's my version, by the way, of the duty of obedience, a distilled version. The board as a whole, every single board member has a responsibility to adhere to that. And just allowing the executive committee to review the 990 before submitting won't necessarily cut it if something is wrong. So I'm a firm believer of getting the board as a whole to review. Again, it can be electronic. They're just reviewing it. They're not approving it. That would be like approving an audit. We don't approve an audit. We accept an audit. Unless you have a board full of auditors who are going to take on, professional liability responsibility for the information in the audit. But yeah, so the long and short of that is while the executive committee probably can just review it, the full board should be reviewing it. Okay. Okay. Whoa, sorry about that. Hang on a second. Things are going crazy. There we go. Okay, let me make sure I covered my notes on that. Oh, I know. The 990 itself, this is true for both your 990 and 990. Well, it's all of your 990s, but specific to the 990 and 990 EZ because you have PDF versions of that versus proof of filing with your 990 postcard, the 990N. Make sure that you have 3 years of that filing on hand. That means that the public can access any of those past 3 years. You should have 7 years of 990s basically in your corporate records. I'm not saying then destroy the rest of them, but 7 years is kind of the look back period. 3 years is what is the obligation for a nonprofit to have on hand if someone were to pick up the phone and say, I want to see your 990 and the 3 years. Now, granted, again, you could theoretically just say, oh, you can get that off of the IRS's website. Well, that's a want type of customer service situation. So it's a lot easier just to say, no problem, I'll be happy to send that over to you. You do not, by the way, you do not need to provide schedules that divulge donor information. So on one of the schedules where if you have, donors that are giving at a really high level or a high percentage of your overall revenue, you have to disclose that information. You do not have to provide that schedule. That's a really important piece. Provide that publicly. Of course, you file that with the IRS. Okay. So when it comes to C3 specific compliance, the 990 is definitely the area we see the biggest issue come up. We'll talk a little, well, I'll talk about it now, even though I put it in the next one. When it comes to the gift acceptance policy, I'm jumping back a little bit. The other spot that I see organizations kind of get in a sticky wicket is on costs related to gifts. So somebody gives you something or wants to give you something, and either there's an acquisition cost to the organization or a carrying cost. And so acquisition cost would basically be the cost of receiving something, not purchasing, literally like transporting something. There's a cost associated with that. Or the holding of something, you might have insurance on a piece of art or special storage because it's a Picasso. By the way, take that carrying cost if you've got that. But nevertheless, you want to be able to, in your gift acceptance policy, point to who's responsible for which costs. I just had, this was different than the hey question, but I also just had a question about a gift of a gift of both real property, so real estate, and a gift of tangible property, so stuff. And basically both of them, or each of them individually, was going to be over that $5,000 mark. Key, write that down. If you're receiving any asset that isn't cash or cash equivalent that has a value of over $5,000, the donor is required to have a qualified appraisal on that asset. You, as an entity, do not have to have a qualified appraisal, but it's good practice to have it, as opposed to just having somebody, hand you a box of rocks and say, this is worth $75,000, and you book it as $75,000 and come to find out it's just a box of rocks. So it's good to actually see that appraisal, but who pays for the appraisal? If we were in a room, I would be looking at you and asking you that question specifically. The answer is the donor pays for the donor's appraisal. If the organization wants to get their own appraisal, they will pay for that. But that appraisal cannot be given to the donor for the donor to use for his or her tax purposes. The donor has to pay for their own appraisal. In addition, there's a nuance of that, and that donor's appraisal has to be dated not more than 60 days before or after, it should be before, the gift, the date of the gift. So there's a small window for that donor. I give you that information not so that you can be providing tax advice to folks, but at least so you can go, wait a minute, there's something wonky about gifts over $5,000 that aren't cash or cash equivalent. What's the wonkiness? The wonkiness is appraisal. The IRS has very clear guidelines. And so literally if you Google appraisal for charitable gift, you're going to get and find it on the actual irs.gov website. You're going to get the information you need. Okay. The next section is still within the C3 specific compliance. The receiving and acknowledgement of gifts is also an area that I get lots of questions on. It's a bizarre thing. At what level do we need to give receipts? And I'm like, did somebody give you money? Did somebody give you something? Then they should get a receipt. It's your opportunity to thank them and acknowledge them. So even though the IRS says you only need written receipts of gifts that are valued at $250 or more, I think that's very bad advice. I think you should just receipt all gifts. And it is basically an intention to avoid the question of whether or not we did we actually receipt that or not. If you make it a standard policy to receipt every single gift, at least a base level receipt, then you never have to lay awake at night wondering whether or not you did. Maybe you have a threshold. This is not a compliance. This is more a stewardship question or comment. But maybe you have a policy of any gift over whatever, $500 or $1,000 or whatever it is, gets a handwritten thank you note, maybe even just on that receipt. Fine. But just receipt all gifts. It just makes the most amount of sense to, especially in this day and age where so many of our gifts are given online. There's an automatic email that can be created in order to get that sent over. Okay. Let's see. Are there additional steps for in-kind services over 5,000? That's a good question. So in-kind services are different than in-kind tangible assets. The in-kind services over 5,000, to my knowledge, there aren't any additional steps. I'm going to come back to a nuance on that in just a moment. When I was talking about the appraisals apply to things that are touchable: real estate, art, um, uh, llamas, hay, stuff like that. Well, hay, not so much. But it's tangible property that gets appraised. When we're talking about in-kind services, the valuation of that is weird, because rarely is there an actual deduction that the individual or the entity can take, meaning the donor. Typically, it's more like a write-off for them, and I'm air quoting the word write-off because that all depends on how they are accounting for it. When I was at the MSU Foundation and when I'm working with organizations now, if somebody wants to make an in-kind service contribution, I typically recommend that that individual provide an invoice for those services and then zero out as a contribution on that invoice. That documentation is sufficient for your organization to book it as a value of whatever. $1,000, $500, $15,000, whatever it might be. And it's better record keeping for the donor as well, and gives them a little bit more flexibility and their accountant more flexibility to treat it however they need to treat it from their tax standpoint. So the quick answer to the question is no, there aren't additional steps for in-kind services over 5,000. Mostly because we're talking about two different things: appraisals over 5,000 for tangible property or real estate, preferably zeroed out invoices for any in-kind services that are granted. So, okay, moving on. Let's see. I want to look here and see if there's anything that is important here. Oh, events. We talked about auctions, casino nights, commercial co-ventures. Let's talk about auctions, 50/50s, etc. You definitely have different record keeping and filing requirements there. It is exceptionally important to follow the rules related to that. There are good step-by-step guides that are provided by the state entities that do deal with those. With auctions, what we want to make sure that we're doing is if you want individuals who come to your auctions and bid on things and are successful buyers of those things, it is important to provide them with as much information as you can, which to help them document and claim their charitable deduction. The way that you do that is you actually put the fair market value of the asset in the auction information. I was just at an auction. They did not have the fair market value of the auction items in there. That makes it hard from a deduction standpoint. But what they didn't want to do is create a floor for bidding, and they did quite well at the auction. So you can choose. But donors, the rule is that the bidders need to know what that fair market value is prior to the bidding. So it's not that you can come back after and say it was this. You should be printing that, or at least have it somewhere where they can access it. Casino nights, I just say don't do them. They're just so rife with gambling stuff. I hate them so much. I mean, I don't say hate very much, but I hate the Green Bay Packers. So sorry if anybody's a big fan. But nevertheless, I also hate casino nights. So my list is short, but vehement when it comes to what's on my hate list. Commercial co-ventures happen when you're least expecting it. I have seen in-town commercial co-ventures occur unknowingly for nonprofits. Essentially, what a commercial co-venture is it's working with a for-profit entity in order to do or sell something that's going to create revenue for your organization and potentially also for that for-profit organization. You also see some in the nonprofit space, but that's usually a little bit easier to deal with. So when you're dealing with a for-profit entity, let's say I'm going to pick Universal Athletic only because I'm picking Universal Athletic, not because there's an actual case study here. Okay, so let's say Universal Athletic comes to who's on the call, Habitat for Humanity, and says, "Hey, Habitat for Humanity, we want to do a branded, sweatshirt line, and obviously making things up, that we want to sell on your behalf. Proceeds will go to you. You have contract requirements there, like defined contract requirements to define out what that commercial co-venture is, as well as then reporting requirements that are going to attach to your 990. Interestingly enough, we've seen that with organizations working with for-profit corporations that are actually domiciled, so headquartered in a different state. That's an interesting scenario because now you actually have a business thing happening in that other state that's triggered filing requirements there. And who knows, I don't know what all. Surprisingly, I don't know what all other 50 states, inclusive of DC, 50 states and districts, what their rules are off the top of my head. But I guarantee you there's something that's going to be required. And there's definitely a handful of states that if you called me and said, we want to do a commercial co-venture with a company that's located in California, New York, Washington, New Jersey, or Florida, I'd be like, no, don't do it. Just don't do it. Pennsylvania would also be on that list. So anyway, those are red flags to be looking out for. It's nothing that you need to be concerned about as in the day-to-day. It's if something happens, we need to have, if we're moving in a direction where we're going to do this, we need to flag this. One other thing on this slide before we move to the level 3, because where are we? 10 minutes. I can do it. Is on audits. You can love them or hate them. Most people hate them. But the reality is that audits get a much bigger, they get way more, they're way more anxiety inducing than they need to be. Primarily because, dispel all rumors. There are no state level requirements for any nonprofit organization to have an actual audit done, an independent audit done. There are no blanket federal requirements where all and any C3 organization must have an audit. There are specific situations where an independent audit is required, and there are general rules of thumb about when audits are a good idea. That's a best practice. But unless you are expending $750,000 or more in federal funds, you don't have a specific requirement for an independent audit. And generally speaking in the industry, think that if you are at that $500,000 level of revenue expenses, you should be looking at doing an independent audit because it does help you get your house in order. And a qualified audit is not a bad thing. So a qualified audit is different than a clean audit. A clean audit comes in and basically says, your numbers look good, and we also have looked at your processes and policies, and those all are good. A qualified audit is one that comes in and there's something that you need to fix. Rarely is that a terrible thing. Usually it's a true up of you don't have a gift processing policy in place or procedure in place, or there was duplicity in how a gift in kind, an in-kind gift of services was recorded. Those are common issues, little I issues, when it comes to audits. If you are not willing to, eager to, able to get an independent audit, then look for what's just considered an independent financial review, where they're just looking at your numbers. They're not looking at also your policies and procedures, but at least to have somebody outside of your organization who's qualified, which by the way is not me, to look at your financial statements, to say, this looks like it's a clean, set of information. That's perfectly okay. There are going to be situations where an audit is required for you, even if it's not legally required. A lot of federal agencies, a lot of grantors charitable solicitation registration. Audits are required at certain levels, or in some cases, carte blanche. And so sometimes those audits are necessary, but in many of those situations, specific on the grantor side, at least, not on the federal agencies, many of those grantors will accept an independent financial review versus an audit. Not all of them, but many of them will. Okay, we're rolling. Not much time. So when we talk about activity-specific compliance, I already talked about the surprise cost related to contributions. That's a big red flag. If you're receiving big or lots of gifts from out of state, that's also a red flag that we need to be looking at something from an activity-specific compliance. And especially in this day and age and time, if we're speaking out about issues, if we're driving up to Helena, if we're talking to our elected officials and or issuing position statements, this also should be a red flag. So I put together some slides specifically as it relates to advocacy and lobbying. The section on the left is kind of the, okay, people, let's stop saying that you can't lobby. You can lobby as a C3. There's just requirements that are associated with it. What we can't be doing is what I just call politicking, of like, vote for Joe Schmo. Like, let's not do that. You can advocate and you can lobby. You just have to follow the rules. Okay. So when it comes to advocating and lobbying, especially, like I said, in today's day and age, we want to make sure that we're following the rules and requirements related to that. When it comes to advocacy, we're really just kind of talking about influencing public opinion. Okay, we're just kind of educating. We're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. But when we're talking about lobbying, we're asking for very specific action. Those are kind of the two realms that we live in. Advocacy is a very happy, loose area to be living in. Lobbying is much more specific as it relates to the rules and regulations. Okay, I gave these as kind of the examples that if we are in the education realm of saying something like 40% of kids cannot read at a basic level, that's information, right? We're providing information. Yes, it's information that's hopefully going to, lead somebody in one direction, but we're sharing facts, research, and statistics. Totally okay. No reporting issue there. No real tracking issue there either. When we move into the level of saying supporting our pre-K program, meaning my organization, helps kids read at a grade level, now I'm advocating, right? I'm advocating, sharing a bias, expressing support, cause or idea, policy, etc. Again, totally okay, not a problem. But now if I come out and say, so therefore vote yes on Bill 123 to fund pre-K for all, now I'm in a lobbying, because what I'm doing is I'm asking people to vote for or against a specific policy. That is lobbying, and that requires tracking. And it's important to understand that that is going to trigger the need to track everything, all expenses, all activity related to it. So if you are living in this lobbying world right here, you need to be tracking all related time and expenses. Time is important. A lot of organizations forget that they need to say, our executive director spends 10 hours a month on lobbying, or whatever it might be. You need to do both time and expenses. The IRS has a lovely little statement that says the total of time and expenses must not be substantial, and then provides you no guidance on what substantial means. And the best practice rule of thumb is to keep it under 5% of your overall organizational time and expenses. So like a 10-hour a month type of scenario, no big deal, right? That's less than 5. I think that's less than 5% of your overarching work. I might be wrong on that. Check my math. But the best place to be is if you are finding yourself regularly in this lobbying world, just file your H election. The IRS allows organizations to opt into basically saying that they are going to be doing this lobbying, and then actually provides you with guidance as to how to go about tracking that. And you have a much higher level of total expenses that you can put towards lobbying, because quite frankly, the IRS says, thank you very much for filing the election. We're going to give you a little bit more grace. The most amount that any organization can spend is $1 million in lobbying and expenses, which is for really big organizations. The likelihood that any of us on this call right now would fall into that is slim to none. But the grid is actually, as far as the table of how much you can spend, is dialed out for you. If you look at the IRS's website underneath lobbying and the H election. Okay. The next area is the area that we hate to talk about, and it's charitable solicitation registration. It is astonishing to me how many people like to pretend they don't know anything about this. I'm like, what rock have you been under? Because charitable solicitation registration has been on the topic or on the top of a lot of people's minds for a long time. So at this point in time, if you're ignoring it, you're doing so out of what I call willful blindness, and don't do that. So if all you're doing is soliciting and receiving gifts from individuals inside of the state of Montana, you can shut your ears for the next couple of minutes. If you're receiving gifts from outside of this this state, or you're actively sending information, emails, newsletters, Facebook pages where you're trolling for additional followers, etc., you need to be paying attention to charitable solicitation registration. The states, the dark green states are the ones that have registration requirements. So there's 38 states that have registration requirements and 3 other states that have select situation registration requirements. It is important to know that I am not telling you that you are going to have to register in 41 states. Even if you are soliciting regularly and getting contributions regularly out of the state of Colorado, you may very well still not need to apply for charitable solicitation registration because maybe you are underneath their threshold. What it means is basically you need to look at the states that you are holding events in, if you are actually holding events in that state. If you are directly targeting state residents via mail, email, or phone calls, and you know it, as in like we're batch sending messages out to folks that live in other states. If you have any sort of in-state office or employee, we have lots of remote employees this day and age, you need to be paying attention to solicitation registration and looking at the likelihood of needing to get registered in that state. If you've heard of this phrase, the Charleston principles, those were created back in the day when people got all up in arms about the fact that we had websites where we were asking for donations, and does that actually trigger us having to register in all 41 states? The answer is maybe. It could. And basically what it means is if you have a website, like all of us do, and that website is an interactive website where you have a Give Now button, where they can process their giving online, you need to be paying attention. And if you have that, and you are actually also reaching out to residents in that state, or you're receiving regular or substantial contributions from that state, you likely have triggered a registration requirement for that state, at least looking at the registration requirements and determining whether or not you've met the threshold. So there's a lot of folks that come to Montana that don't live in Montana. They're residents of other states, Minnesota, Washington, California, Texas, you name it. All those states that I just mentioned all have solicitation registration requirements. If you're regularly receiving contributions from people that live in those states normally, or big contributions from individuals, or, by the way, grantors that are in those states, then you need to be looking at charitable solicitation registration requirements there. The registration process, I put it actually here on the right-hand side. From our vantage point, we just look at what the priority registration does. By the way, we provide charitable solicitation registration compliance for clients as well, and help organizations walk through this. We want to be looking at where you have the most activity and where you have the most amount of money coming from. Those are the states that we want to look at. The one pro tip here is this unified registration statement. That was like supposed to be this bellwether change to the charitable solicitation registration process. It's all well and good, except the URS, the unified registration statement, is actually only now accepted in 2 states. Other states will accept it, but there's 1,000 other pieces of information that you need to give to those. I always recommend that an organization complete the unified registration statement to gather the information they need and use that as kind of their Rosetta Stone as they're going, Rosetta Stone? Whatever. When they're going out into looking at other state requirements, they can use that as their touch point to have the information in one place in order to transfer that information over to state specific registration requirements. Okay, I know we're running late, always for me. Okay, so all of this as it relates to compliance, yay, wow, I'm exhausted. What do we do, right? So how do we stay compliant? Well, I'm going to give you two forms that you can, well, one form and one sheeter to help you stay compliant. The two biggest things that organizations need to do is number one, figure out who is responsible for this. It is not only who's responsible for doing it, but also who has oversight responsibility to ensure it's completed. Spoiler alert, the answer is it's the board. The board has overarching responsibility to ensure completion of compliance because that is their governance responsibility. But more often than not, it's the board it's not the board who's executing the exact or the specific tasks. In the absence, of course, of employees, the board is going to be executing those tasks. But if they, regardless of whether or not it's the board doing the work, somebody needs to be assigned and be clear about what it is and when they need to have it done. And then from my perspective, you need to be doing this on an annual basis, this compliance review. So I've put together this long, literally long list of compliance. This is a 2023 document. Not much has changed. But basically, this is a checklist that says, okay, our Form 990, we have to file it by the 15th day of the 5th month after the tax year, 3-month extension, blah, blah, blah. How often do we have to do it? We have to do it annually. Who's responsible for it? CFO, CEO, I don't know who it is. Have we done it? Or have we done it? Is it in work? Is it in progress? Is it unneeded because we're an organization we're a church organization? We don't need to file the 990? Fine. Or have we deferred it? That box, by the way, should never be checked for this particular section. I should have grayed that out. This document is intended to be a living, breathing document that gets redone every single year. And what I mean by that is like you would write up here, 2024. The board would want to see this on like a quarterly basis of where are we with each of these types of things. It's a really good way to just keep your house in order and keep everybody on track. The best way I've seen this used is in a shared document. So it's a shared document where individuals who are responsible for it can go back to it, update the status, add notes if they want. You can seal this. I don't mind. And use it. The big thing is this number one is if you're not doing lobbying, advocacy, or political activities, just gray that out. We don't need to care about it, right? We don't need to be thinking about it. Ungray it the moment that you drive to Helena. And then when you get down to this other NPO specific matters, this is basically things that might be not on this list that are applicable to you. So you have let's see, background checks for volunteers. Maybe you're a youth organization, that you have to do background checks for volunteers. So maybe that would be a compliance piece that you would put in here, and who's responsible for that and how often we're having to do that. That is, quite frankly, a big fat elephant that you need to eat one bite at a time. And so if that is overwhelming for you, don't ignore it, but you can start with this. So this document basically is the real quick cheat list of do's and don'ts. So do complete your filings appropriately, completely, and timely. If you can go through this on an annual basis and said, did it, etc., amen for you, A+. But if there are areas that you can't do that, then it's definitely a spot that you need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. It is important to understand that this document here is not intended to be a replacement for this. It is intended to be your baby step in. So this document here will give you kind of that gut check of where are we? and hopefully have you feeling a little bit better about, I think I'm forgetting something. I think I'm forgetting something. The likelihood is if you're, well, number one, if you're on this call, it's highly unlikely that you are forgetting something because you're paying attention. But most importantly, the vast majority of things that you need to be paying attention to are on these sheets. So it does provide you, like I said, with kind of a shorthand look as to what it is that you need to be doing, and then a working document that you can continue to go back to, track your progress against goal, and then most importantly is celebrate the successes along the way. When you get to the point where at the end of the year or whatever the period, and you can say that you have completed all of this, holy Hannah, open the bubbly, alcoholic or not, doesn't matter, and have a celebratory toast to it, because it is incredible how many organizations just kind of hope and pray that compliance, ignorance, won't catch them. But the reality is it absolutely will. And the biggest thing is, if you don't know, just call. Well, I guess just call or email, and ask. I have every single day I'm on a phone call with a nonprofit that's just a quick question. Happy to answer those. I'm not going to say, and now you need to pay Bannack or whatever, in order to get those little questions taken care of. The goal is to help. Part of the reason that we started Bannack is to help nonprofits just achieve more. Our motto literally is do more, better. Excellent English, I know. But nevertheless, we can do that. We can do that in just a quick phone call, to help you sleep better at night and feel better about what it is that you're doing. Then we're all for it. So that is the information. I have used up so many of my words today. So many words. I know that we're a little over what I was hoping for, but I certainly am willing to answer questions. And I'm going to stop the screen share. Come back.
Thank you so much, Melanie. We do have a question in the chat. It says for the registration, I'm assuming it's the compliance registration in other states. It says, what if the individual lives here, but the fund or foundation is held or operates in another state?
So I'll give you the legal answer first. And the legal answer is, what matters is the domicile of the actual donor. And what that would mean then is the domicile of the actual donor would be the foundation, and it would be whatever state that they are organized and operating in that applies. That being said, there are times where you've solicited the individual and they've made the decision to give the gift out of their foundation. You didn't solicit the foundation. You solicited that individual and they made the choice to have the gift paid that direction. I'm not real concerned about that scenario. I'd be real concerned if they were giving you $1 million and normally you only get $250,000 a year in gift income. The reason it would make me nervous is because, number one, it's going to cause a red flag on your 990, because you're going to have to show that you had unusual activity, you had an unusual grant. Fine, as long as you can stand on your hind legs and justify it, there's no issue there. But the foundation also has reporting requirements. The foundation actually has to say where those gifts went, where the allocations went. And so there's a little bit of a tattletale component happening there where it could be possible that you got swept up by the report by the foundation that this grant was made. If that ever occurs, you just beg forgiveness from the state, because it's a one-off thing and you didn't solicit the foundation. You solicited the individual who's a resident of the state of Montana, and hopefully the solicitation occurred inside of the state of Montana as opposed to, in their home state, or excuse me, in the state where the foundation was. I've seen that happen. It actually just happened to a compliance client that we've had, and we just asked for forgiveness. And honestly, the state just wants their $35 or $350 or whatever it might be. But what's important to know is that once you get registered with it, if you beg forgiveness and the state still says you must register, you have to keep up with that registration. You're on notice that they have noticed you. Yeah. So the long and short of it is I wouldn't be too concerned about it. But be prepared if if you get caught up on that tattletale side of things.
Thank
Other
you.
questions?
I think we have time for about one more question if anyone wants to ask now, or as Melanie said, I will include her email address and her phone number in our follow-up email from today's session if you simmer on this information and have a quick question for her later. Anyone else have questions? You're also welcome to send them to me in the chat anonymously if you don't want it to be a public question. I'm happy to ask on your behalf.
Yeah, and I'll just say in full disclosure, I rarely answer my phone if I don't recognize the number. So don't be afraid to leave a message, or even just text me and let me know, because then I'll answer. But in this day, I don't know what my 14-year-old son put my phone number into, but I am getting the most amount of spam I'm ever getting, and it's all to William, which is my son's actual first name, even though he goes by Griffin. Yeah.
That's actually hilarious. Well, I don't see any popping in the chat, so I'm just going to take a minute to wrap us up. But again, feel free to follow up with questions. I am going to process this video, send out a follow-up email with our recording, our slides, some of the materials we referenced today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself about our programs, or feel free to reach out to Melanie about today's content. But thank you for being here. I was telling Melanie before the session, for Give Big, we do actually check as a community foundation everybody's state compliance and IRS compliance. And every year, I always find a handful of nonprofits who have fallen out of compliance. So I so appreciate you all taking the time to be proactive and learn this information so we can keep everybody in good standing. Thank you for taking the time to learn with us. And a huge thank you to Melanie for sharing her time and expertise. If there's anything we can do, let us know. And we will see you all at the next Nonprofit Cafe session. But thank you, Melanie. Seriously, so grateful for your expertise always.
Happy to help.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Here.